The heinously evil terrorism group, the neo-Nazis, were established by name in December 1943. They committed a mass murder of almost all elected members of the Parliament of Germany that month. Only around 10 were left alive afterwards. The rest were buried in a mass grave, and photographs were taken to document the mass murder. The group may have kept the identities and clothing of some of the victims. There were well over 600 elected members of Parliament murdered, approximately. They also abducted the Kaiser and Chancellor Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern and made him a prisoner of war in Yugoslavia in a modified, never-commissioned underground subway train station converted into a jail. As a side note, in the 1950s, in some countries, people watched pirate television broadcasts of a show called The Kaiser Adolf Hitler Chained Up in the Train Station show. It featured edited footage, like highlights, of him being held prisoner, filmed with film cameras. After the Kaiser and Chancellor was abducted, the neo-Nazis then attacked and captured all maximum security prisons in Germany, one by one, at gunpoint. In some cases, prisons were taken in bloody extended gunfights with guards and staff that lasted up to a week or more. It all started with Dachau Prison. It was a temporary maximum security prison built on property I own as part of my Hohenzollern royal family estate. The site where the prison was is now in my name as the owner. Dachau Prison was built to house some of the worst lifers, multiple life sentences, and never to be released convicted psychos in Europe who were attempting to run amok in Germany like a road trip plague, regularly. They were all fairly legally arrested, investigated, tried, convicted, and sentenced. They were not mistreated in any way. Dachau was originally intended to be a temporary measure. The nations the convicted lifers were citizens or residents of were supposed to take them back after sentencing so they could serve their sentences in their home country. That was the legal reality of the situation via legal agreements and treaty deals in Europe and other parts of the world. Those nations started refusing to take them back to serve their sentences, and they ended up stuck in Germany in temporary maximum security jails. There was nothing flimsy about them. They were usable for the purpose they were built on an ongoing basis. But they were supposed to be temporary until the inmates were deported home. They were full of some of the most heinously hideous criminals of the world during World War II. It is difficult to describe. Dachau had around 900 inmates, very approximately, at any one time when near capacity. 900 the likes of Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Hannibal Lecter, Peter Sutcliffe, Ivan Milat, Mark Adrian Perry, etc. The people who were in them were so hideously evil, in such large numbers, in such a small space, that jokes were made about them being like the distilled essence of evil in the one building. The nickname was concentration camp. Concentrated essence of pure psycho by the 900 in one overly comfortable jail. Brushing their hair, doing sketches, pretending to conduct orchestras, complaining about the desserts, etc. The neo-Nazis captured the jails one by one, and illegally released the inmates to join them. The escaped inmates were told they could join the neo-Nazis, or go free to attempt to fend for themselves in late 1943 World War II Germany. In the case of Dachau, the escapees who decided to try their luck roaming free were attacked by the rest and murdered on the spot, for a lack of solidarity. Around 10% of the escapees were murdered by the rest. Like it was decision made, majority in, all in, or die. Forgot to tell you that bit. The escaped inmates were then compared to the deceased and illegally detained but seriously wounded prison staff. Everyone, from the employed prison governor to the cooks, cleaners, and security guards. Escaped inmates were picked out, one by one, based on similarities, to pretend to be the real staff, using their stolen documents, security tags, and clothing. As close as they could get based on height, weight, hair and eye colors, etc., was what they chose. Some were even given a quick makeover to match security photographs by award-winning film production staff. They then pretended to illegally take over running the jail when the decision was made to fill the prison with homosexuals of one gender only, illegally abducted at gunpoint from the German public population in the major cities. Particularly the CBD and inner suburbs of each city. Dachau was used to illegally detain male victims that lived in Berlin at the time. I am sure of that. One escaped inmate was the exception to the routine, and it was the worst one in there. Ricky O'Shea. He was serving 9 life sentences for sexual assault, genital mutilation, and murder. Amongst other offenses. He was labeled never to be released by the German courts, sentenced to the term of his natural life, as there was no death penalty in Germany at the time. His reputation preceded him during his arrest through to trial. He was well known at the time for a psycho. Organized crime people had already casually speculated about the idea that he looked enough like Hermann going to maybe attempt to pass himself off as Hermann before the neo-Nazis actually did anything prior to December 1943. It was based on his mugshots compared to photos of Hermann. He didn't look a lot like Hermann, he was just a bizarrely similar shape and weight. Vaguely similar in looks. Hermann was abducted after being knocked unconscious at a Berlin coffee shop. There were photographs taken of him lying unconscious at a very expensive mahogany coffee table with condiments on it. He was photographed lying on his back, with the chair still under him, in a very expensive Hungarian-style military-themed dinner suit. To reinforce the reality of the lunacy, since television became affordably available to the public after World War II, heavily subsidized. People pretended the photographs of him unconscious were taken after he committed suicide, with the Allies bearing down on his location in 1945, to avoid arrest and trial for crimes committed during WW2. With a suicide note found on the coffee table. Then that he was tried at Nuremberg for crimes committed during World War II, in November 1945, after the fake suicide story mentioned earlier. using footage of Ricky O'Shea on trial with Herman Going's name edited over the accused name in the film audio. Then that Herman was found guilty of crimes committed by O'Shea at the Nuremberg trials in 1946 and sentenced to life in jail. Then that the photographs were of Herman dead in jail afterwards after committing suicide in the jail wearing a very expensive Hungarian military-style dinner suit at a mahogany-turned-leg coffee table with condiments on it. And jail scrawled suicide note found with the body. Vanilla cake and a latte, too, approximately. As if that was normal for a jail inmate serving life. Going was so badly disfigured in the face when abducted during December 1943 that nobody could recognize him by sight alone. It was nearly impossible. He was stripped of his uniform down to thermal underwear and dumped in Dachau illegally for being homosexual. His clothing and identification items were then used to make O'Shea look like him, including a full professional film production crew makeover, as if for a film role as Going. Going never appeared at the Nuremberg trials at all, he wasn't even called as a witness. O'Shea was murdered in jail in 1946. Other inmates found out who he was and what he did to homosexuals with the neo-Nazis whilst pretending to be Herman Going. They had been described the cinema reels and extended films of his trial. They brutally killed him in jail before he had served a year of his sentence. When the Nuremberg trials were unofficially broadcast on television, Herman Going's name had been superimposed over the audio where Ricky O'Shea's name was read by anyone in the court during his trial. O'Shea died in 1946, Going in the mid-1960s. They are pretending the O'Shea family is waiting to be illegally given Going's estate, illegally withheld from the beneficiaries since he died in the mid-1960s. Because the names were swapped over on the trial audio for television. Insanity. Look up the Nuremberg trials now and see O'Shea on trial, regardless of the labeling. O'Shea was the grandfather of a female who was pretending to be my oldest sister when I was born. She was illegally registered to my father at birth because his grandfather Prince Sebastian Habsburg was tortured by O'Shea in Dachau for 17 months between January 1944 and June 1945. There she was when I was born in my family household as follow-up stalking of my father's paternal family, looking a lot like her grandfather O'Shea. She was 12 when I was born and knew why she was there. They gave O'Shea the illegal unofficial job of running Dachau prison after he escaped it in December 1943. As if the governor. But they did not give him the fatally wounded but alive governor's identity. Not like the other escaped inmates who started pretending to be staff. They made O'Shea over to look like Herman Going instead, in Herman's clothes, with his identity documents. That was despite the fact that Herman Going never worked for the law enforcement and government departments associated with running prisons in Germany at all. It was a random thing, completely out of context of the rest of their actions. The actual governor was fatally wounded in the raid on the jail by the neo-Nazis. He was then dumped in the jail, with nobody bothering to steal his identity at all. He died in the jail as one of the early illegally detained victims. Was homosexual. There were photographs taken of him after he died, laying on the ground with his hands between his legs, before the prison was filled with abduction victims. Herman Going had nothing to do with running jails. He was abducted from the coffee shop in Berlin in December 1943. Disfigured in the face beyond recognition. Then dumped in the jail in his thermal underwear for being homosexual. He survived until the end of World War II. Was interviewed. Not called as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. And died in the mid-1960s. His estate was illegally withheld from the beneficiaries when he died. The person tried at Nuremberg, including for illegally using Herman Going's identity for around 18 months, was tried for pretending to be the prison governor from the governor's on-site office and nearby off-site residence. But O'Shea was not using the deceased governor's identity. Using Herman Going's instead, who was completely irrelevant to running jails his whole life. Like obvious sports corruption, zoomed in, slow motion, on IMAX. Insane is the word. When the neo-Nazis took the building, Kaiser and Chancellor Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern did emergency radio frequency broadcasts from, in case the emergency frequencies were all that was left, they got a voice impersonator in. A New Zealand-born female called Isabel Williams, nicknamed Fritz. She used to get around dressed like a man. They made the audio quality as deteriorated as they could. People who heard her fake broadcasts could barely hear the details, even when the transistor radios were held up against the ear. Williams asked German citizens and residents to go to the usual places requested in similar broadcasts done by the real Kaiser Adolf. If people responded and went to venues like schools, hospitals, factories, and air raid shelters as requested, they were mass murdered. Photographs of them were taken lying dead in the venues. In a lot of cases the poisons or toxins used were supplied by South Americans from places like Argentina. They developed a reputation nobody else knew about because of it, expecting fear from anyone part German afterwards, by assumption. Williams was made over by that award-winning film production crew to look like Kaiser and Chancellor Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern after participating in the beginnings of the mass genocide of German citizens and residents. She wasn't appropriate to be made over, under the rules and specifications they were using. But she lured millions to their deaths over the barely audible radio broadcasts with her voice impersonation, so they made her over anyway. Gave her a Kaiser Hitler costume to wear every day, etc. Attempts to portray her as the real Kaiser Adolf dead in that bunker in Berlin in 1945 are that pathetic. She had a vagina and breasts, you know. Williams was heavily menstruating when shot dead. She was shot for pretending to sexually penetrate a fatal bullet wound to Janet Podolsky's forehead whilst gyrating at the hips and screaming in an Adolf Hitler costume in front of onlookers when she was shot dead. She had just shot Podolsky at random minutes earlier than her sister and cousin. The neo-Nazi-caused mass genocide. Deceased citizens and residents of Germany were stripped of all clothing and identification, which were stockpiled. Down to naked. Their bodies were then processed through fertilizer production factories used to process things like animal carcasses. Those fertilizer plants left only bones afterwards. The bones of the victims were then mill ground down to a fine powder. It was added to enormous mass stockpiles of concrete mix in storage in Germany. There were no bodies left afterwards, regardless of how many million were mass murdered by the neo-Nazis. People still say no bodies. What mass genocide of German citizens and residents? They use the victims' family identities when saying it, in a lot of cases. People who wandered into the deserted centers of the major cities in Germany were told if they could find clothing of victims that fit them, they could use the clothes. If the clothing had identity documents and valuables with the clothes, they could use the identities and keep the valuables. They were told that if the clothing had photo identification in it, to pick someone with similar looks where possible. Then clothes that fit, ideally. There were millions of victims' clothing to choose from. People sorted through them looking for something in huge piles in warehouses and aircraft hangars. In massive skip bins full of clothing and personal items. Tens of thousands of family identities were stolen that way. Including organized crime trash stealing entire large family identities for a group of thieves. The identity thieves then scoped out the residences of the mass genocide victims. Scoured the houses, flats, apartments, and units clean of anything even remotely valuable. Adding to their personal collection of identity items as they went. It was decided that living in the housing, pretending to be the deceased victims wasn't as easy or sensible as it could have sounded. They mass murdered millions, but there were still tens of millions of Germans who were not dead. Including the homosexuals illegally held prisoner in jails by escaped inmates. They would likely recognize the difference quite readily. So, they demolished the residences of the victims during 1944 and 1945, coordinated by the neo-Nazis. It is safe to assume they tried to demolish the accommodation of nearly every person murdered in that mass genocide of citizens and residents of Germany by the neo-Nazis starting December 1943. They had all the clothing, with all the identification people were required to carry due to circumstance, in huge stockpiles. And almost no bodies at all, if any. Lunatics were recruited to destroy the residences of the victims after they were picked clean of valuables and other useful items. People were paid to go to the properties, drill holes, plant TNT, dynamite, and incendiary devices. Light the fuses, then run away quickly and wait for them to detonate. Then pile up the rubble to make it appear to be air raid bombings. Top floor down, one floor at a time. They were also told to dye the rubble particular colors. Do anything to make it appear to be air raid bombings. The lunatics were fueled by alcohol and early amphetamines, like crystal meth. Any illicit drug they pretended Kaiser Adolf was on in fake history records is a safe assumption. People became so obsessed with it, giggling like lunatics in huge demolishing squads, that they took huge risks. It was estimated that over 40,000 people died due to not running away in time after planting the explosives and incendiary devices and were killed by their own planted explosives. It was the final explanation for tens of thousands of dead perpetrators' body parts, like arms and legs, being found in the rubble in Berlin alone after World War II. Afterwards, there were very few of the mass genocide victims' residences left. After World War II ended, the identity thieves, in the victims' stolen clothing with identity documents and portable keepsakes, did their best impersonation of German citizens and residents they could muster. With hair dye and deceased victims' clothing. They pretended the damage was air raids with bombings, fake German accents, and pretended to plead cry homeless due to bombings. Asking for help from Allied forces and others after mid-1945. Oh. No. My apartment. Please help. In the best fake German accent they could put on. Given that Air forces during World War II had complete records of where actual bombings were ordered to take place in Germany. How many very expensive and cumbersome bombs were dropped? Where they were supposed to hit based on planning, down to the square meter. And where they landed and went off due to tracking and video footage in flight. They cannot pass off the demolishing destruction of mass-murdered German citizens and residents' accommodation by the neo-Nazis as bombing either. The Allies did not bomb residential areas in most cases. The neo-Nazis tried to demolish every residence of a German citizen or resident they mass-murdered during 1943, 44, and 45. All based on the addresses found on the victims' clothing. Found after there was no intact bodies to account for. Now have another look at film of Berlin in June or July 1945 on the internet. Keep in mind the majority of the damage was mass genocide victims and missing persons' places of residence demolished from within Germany by lunatics who went to the addresses found on identity documents in the deceased victims' clothing. With very few intact bodies accounted for. Body parts found in the rubble of deceased persons were people blowing up the buildings that didn't run away in time after fuses were lit by hand. So, who amongst the Allied air forces and other military decided to pretend the residences were destroyed by bombings too? As if especially for the identity thieves. The air forces who dropped the bombs knew they weren't bombings. that cater for the family identity thief routine, followed by the spread of the take-home television after World War II, does not equal magic powers to steal any identity and wealth anytime now. People still routinely wear the clothing of German citizens and residents killed in that neo-Nazi mass genocide in the major cities of Germany from December 1943 through to mid-1945. They still have huge stockpiles. They claim it is tradition to wear the victims' clothes from the mid-20th century when stalking people. Particularly anyone who is part German, obviously. Me in particular. No matter how offensively out of place they look whilst wearing them. There were complicating issues though. It wasn't as easy as it seemed or sounded. German citizens and residents were mercilessly randomly attacked with the mumps during puberty from the early 1800s. Lunatics cut a swathe through Germany every year, infecting anyone who looked puberty age at random, like a roving mob. Including citizens of nations part of the defunct Kingdom of Prussia that were outside of Germany. One of the motives was Prussia owning nothing in Germany when it existed until permanently defunct in 1941. It caused Germany to have massive adult infertility issues in the 18 and 1900s. Including from WW1 right through to WW2. There was a huge demand for babies for adoption by citizens and residents of Germany as a result. Infertile couples, victims of the puberty infection rampages, looking to adopt children. In the 1900s it coincided with another illegal phenomenon. Baby thefts from residents of the state of Victoria, Australia between World War I and World War II. The infants were stolen at birth or shortly after birth by the thousands. All stolen from Port Phillip Bayside suburbs like St Kilda and Brighton. Those suburbs had huge numbers of small unit-sized birthing hospitals. It was a very sensible and somewhat traditionally fashionable place to have children. It was particularly popular amongst couples from what is now called Gippsland. Also Ballarat, Bendigo, West Victoria and the Murray region. Mostly Gippsland and the then locals, though. I won't mince words here. The phenomenon was caused by dirty money funded to two particular now AFL clubs. Money from Canada, for the most part. They funded one team, who paid another to do the dirty work. Violence against new mothers who made complaints was not unusual in some cases. People still pretend to brag about their parents and grandparents beating or kicking women who complained that all but one baby was missing after having a multiple birth. The stolen babies were immediately offered to anyone who wanted to leave with one as immediately as possible. Including on boats and then planes. As long as they weren't staying in the Bayside region. Any leftovers were then shipped to what is now the state of Tasmania, usually. The Tasmanians then did the basics for the stolen children. They weren't being Good Samaritan types at all. Even if they tried to fake it. They weren't happy about it. They didn't want to do it in bulk, really. They agreed, though. So, they muttered and swore, complaining about how many babies they had to feed, change nappies for, and put up with. I sometimes jokingly called them Spaswegians after hearing people describe Tasmania as Taswegia repeatedly. But it sounds a little offensive to people from Norway, and I am part Norwegian. The Tasmanians did what they agreed to do. Then picked from the huge bunch of stolen children. Like picking one type of chocolate out of boxes of chocolates when deciding which ones they wanted to keep and raise themselves. They were not the equivalent of Good Samaritans who took and dumped babies from Victoria as if running unofficial orphanages. They were filthy organized crime, hiding stolen babies from their enraged parents who were all from the state to the north. Victoria. The rest were dumped in foreign countries for possible adoption in hordes. The biggest demand going around between World War I and World War II was Germany. Due to its difficulties with extremely high rates of adult infertility. Most of the unchosen stolen children ended up there. Mysteriously filling an almost constant need of German couples on waiting lists looking for children to adopt. The Tasmanians involved always tried to convince the ones they kept themselves and the ones dumped in Germany and other places that they were Tasmanians, even indigenous Tasmanians, first. Before keeping them or dumping them for adoption. Unless they tried to badmouth the victim parents whose babies were stolen by pretending the babies were dumped and abandoned by irresponsible Victorians instead of stolen. Then that they were Good Samaritan instead do hiding the stolen children from their parents. They weren't Tasmanians at all. They were all Victorians. Particularly indigenous to Gippsland. Also, Ballarat and Bendigo, etc. The second biggest category was locals to Port Phillip Bayside areas. Mostly indigenous Gippslanders, to be frank. Those families killed in a mass genocide by the neo-Nazis between December 1943 and mid-1945 had quite a lot of adopted children around at the time. And some that were the intergenerational descendants of stolen children adopted by German citizens and residents. Quite a few survivors of World War II amongst the rest. That bizarre extra connection between Germany and places like Gippsland that cannot be explained by my Hohenzollern royal family being part Gippslander since at least the 1790s via Princess Louise, also the Queen of Prussia. She was originally from the old city of Yarragon in what is now Gippsland before emigrating to Mecklenburg-Strelitz as a child. She married future Kaiser Frederick Wilhelm III, also the future King of Prussia at the time. They were both homosexual and just got on really well intellectually. No sex involved, obviously. It doesn't matter what they do, they cannot find a way to account for the babies stolen off people from Victoria, Australia between World War I and World War II. Those that were adopted by German couples on adoption waiting lists due to infertility problems until mid-WW2. Their genocide terrorism records are quite detailed, but they can't tell you if many of those babies from Victoria adopted by German couples were mass murdered by the neo-Nazis during WW2. They tear their hair out over it. People discuss being part Australian because of it in Germany, so they know descendants exist. But when they state they think they're part Tasmanian, they are wrong. Lied to by people who had stolen babies in Tasmania before dumping them at adoption agencies in Germany who had a convenient constant demand. Those people who think they are, or their ancestors were, Tasmanians are wrong. They can get on okay until they try to talk about being Tasmanians. Then it becomes a difficult process as they are just plain wrong. They are part Gippslander, etc. Part Victoria, Australia. Tasmanians' connection excuses that they were once Burinom living in what is now Gippsland 2 in its southwest before mass emigrating to Tasmania of their own accord and decision thousands of years ago doesn't get them out of it. Yarryalu and Gunakonai are the two remaining cultural indigenous groups in Gippsland. Yarryalu has been rarely mentioned since the arson riot in 1858 caused 1.5 million people to become homeless in Gippsland. And since the Yarra River was named as a memorial to the old city of Yarragon in Gippsland. It is cobblestones that are over 500 years old from the old city of Yarragon lining the banks of the river in some places. All that very Gippsland-looking north shape. Using the cultural term Yarryalu to describe one of the two Gippsland indigenous cultural groups has not been banned, officially or unofficially. There is nothing wrong with mentioning it. People who claim it being mentioned is not allowed have got it very wrong, regardless of the excuse. There is one other valuable piece of information to remember here. It is a simple one. People who prepared and broadcast fake fictionalized history programs and material over the new medium television in unmonitored pirate broadcasts before television was regulated after World War II and their descendants do not have any magic powers or right of self-exemption from reality or the law. They cannot make up any fictional story they like to steal whatever they want, no matter how pushy or violent they get about it. Regardless of the pointless hours put into embellishing the historical lies since the 1950s. Including into the modern computer age. They will talk as if they are minutes away from stealing millions in seconds from randomly chosen bank accounts whenever they need money with a 3-minute internet transaction with some fake video, images, and audio and a repugnantly obvious corrupt sports result to go with it that they don't talk about as if wrong at all. But they are not getting that world. Regardless of how much of a violently perverted, disgusting, and spoilt brat screeching dribbling lunatic corruption act they put on. Including the my ancestors faked that information for television starting 1949, spoiled brat child, whimpering lunatic noise. They are incessantly pathetic, violent, and annoying. Screeching that their plans for randomly taking whatever they want to steal with adulterated brat corrupt vomit on the TV and internet to match are mesmerizing to the intended victim that makes the victim play along. If the violence since satellites went into orbit and 24-hour multispectrum perverted illegal surveillance that is available to them didn't get it done for them by the year 2000, it never will. Intergenerational arguments don't cut it. They are not more thug magical than their ancestors and relatives responsible for the intellectual vomit in the 1940s and 1950s just because they have computers to do it with now. The amount of commensurately insane sports corruption to go with their brat attitude is abhorrent. It is never going to happen. Everyone knows it. Assumed residual inherent fear of them as associates of the perpetrators from World War II doesn't work. It never will. As an example. When I was assaulted and my semen stolen when unconscious at age 16 in October 1988, a female used my stolen sperm on her boyfriend's penis in front of her video camera that same night in a building I have never been into. She recorded it on videotape. He was a descendant of a person executed in 1917 for pretending to be a Romanov royal in public for the first time after my real Romanov family royals were abducted and murdered the year before in 1916. She didn't get pregnant with his sperm. It was my stolen sperm. She was around 40 at the time. She must be nearing the 80 mark now. After the first pregnancy to my stolen sperm was given birth to, they decided to, quote, try a little fake history television magic on me. They wrote a script for a television series and it went into production. Their retardedly implausible theory was that if they could make me pretend I am bisexual and I was there watching her have sex with her boyfriend but just out of shot behind the camera, they might be able to steal off me. As if them pretending I consented to her using my sperm on her boyfriend's penis whilst watching them have sex and ejaculated especially for her but was out of shot for it would override the constitutional monarchy law and make the result of the pregnancy eligible to be royalty in my royal family in some way. Just because she had the videotape and they could alter it. Complete rubbish. They took film footage of her house where I collapsed and was assaulted outdoors, some other film of the surrounding area. Collected up all the directly involved perpetrators' furniture and items of clothing etc. Then, I have to say allegedly, used it in the new TV series. Then they made her over in an attempt to make her look like an American teenager who was dressed up for the prom. Got her pregnant with my stolen sperm again and took photographs of her posing to look like an around 18-year-old American female whilst she squirmed in disgust at having my stolen, rape-obtained, 16-year-old's homosexual sperm inside her whilst the photographs were taken. Then, again I have to say allegedly, used the photos in the TV series as pictures of a murdered teenage female in the series. It was called Twin Peaks, apparently. They pretended if I watched it, I would be mesmerized by it, and stalking of me by satellite and in person, into pretending it was a bisexual three-way, and I ejaculated in her hands for her on request. As if that would make the children eligible for any of my royal family estates or other assets. I watched around 1.5 episodes when it was on twice a week at the time. They had people stalking me at high school talking about it incessantly as if it was the most awesome spooky TV show ever put on TV. I thought it was boring rubbish where people just fondled the same furniture over and over again and looked at the same photos of the fictional victim holding them and staring. Which looked silly. Zoolander spooky and absolute rubbish, and never watched it again. They are still pretending I might try to find her for a chat. She must be around 80 by now. As if all constitutional monarchy law can be worked around illegally, provided it is fake history. The series crashed in popularity afterwards. Rubbish. Descendants of the people responsible for those first fake history programs for the TV after WW2 and the extremely elderly original ones still alive are not getting whatever they want to steal whenever they demand it. Neither are descendants of people who stole neo-Nazi mass genocide victims who were German citizens and residents' family identities during and after World War II. They are a worse problem than anyone ever factors in. Including missed shots at goal by their relatives being awarded a goal live in TV, despite the obvious miss, and nobody appearing to say a word on the coverage as if it wasn't even noticeable. And vice versa. They are still pretending they are allowed to stalk me because I didn't watch and try to play along, as if mesmerized. Too low for words.